Anyway, thanks, Tom. And thank you to all of you for being here. I know there's a lot of options, including just sitting in the sunshine or walking around, and we're thrilled to have you here. And I think we want to make this as useful for you as possible. We've got a great panel. Some dear friends of mine are up here, people we've all known each other for a long time as well. And what we will do, of course, is that many panels will talk for a while, and then we'll open it up to your questions. And please feel free to ask us anything about the Olympic Games. The topic, as Tom said, is the legacy of the Olympics. And I'm sure for some of you that's an interesting concept even, because for you, as Tom was referring, the Games show up at the end of July. They'll begin again in London. And we have every 2 years now, not every 4, but every 2. The winter and the summer are staggered ever since the 92. We had both summer and winter, and then 94 went to the winter to be off schedule from the summer games. And that was scheduling, that was sponsorship, corporate decisions, what have you. So every 2 years we have an Olympic Games, and they pop up. And I think one of the great delights of the Olympics, and one of the reasons the TV ratings are so high, is because they're not around all the time. Olympic athletes never overstay their welcome. They are literally, they drop into our lives for 2 weeks, into our homes, into your living room, your family room, when you watch on TV or online or wherever we're going to get the news this time around, and then they disappear. And in many cases, they're gone forever. We never see them again. In some wonderful cases, they keep competing, or they obviously come back in other capacities. So that's the Olympics, and I think that's the allure of the Olympic Games, that these athletes never overstay their welcome. But the Games, as you know, they leave a city, the circus picks up and moves on, and then what next? What is going on in that city, in that country, the amount of money, billions of dollars that now are spent on the Olympic Games, and then what? And I think for us up here to talk first a little bit about the Olympic experience, especially since we have 2 Olympic medalists with us, and then to kind of branch off into the idea of legacy, responsibility could be another word, of what the Olympics and what Olympic leaders and Olympic athletes should bring to the community, to the country, what they should take back to their own country. It's a fascinating conversation, and again, we're thrilled that you're here with us today. So let me introduce the panel, and then we will charge right into this. I'm going to start with the woman in the middle, Michelle Kwan, the most decorated figure skater in United States history. And I have had the great delight to interview her as a 13-year-old and to interview her as a 31-year-old. And I am here to tell you she has not changed one bit, except become smarter and more beautiful and all of that. But in terms of the personality, the humility, it's all there. I can think of no one who is a greater representative of this country and the Olympic movement than Michelle Kwan. A few facts about Michelle: 9 national figure skating titles, 5 world championships, 2 Olympic medals. Now that's on the ice, and you all, I'm sure, remember her very, very well. The most dominant figure skater at the most turbulent time in the history of the sport. You can make a strong case she's the greatest figure skater to ever lace up the skates. But there's a whole nother act for Michelle Kwan. And in addition to college and getting your master's degree, 2006, Condi Rice appointed you, Michelle, as the first U.S. public diplomacy envoy for the United States. You're on the President's Council of Physical Fitness and on the Board of Directors of Special Olympics, among many other things, and the future, who knows how bright it is. Ladies and gentlemen, Michelle Kwan. Tom McMillen on the end here. Tom, chair of the National Foundation on Fitness, Sports, and Nutrition. Tom's resume is, well, we could be here the whole day talking about your resume, Tom, so we won't do that, but a few highlights. Tom's a former U.S. congressman from Maryland, an 11-year NBA veteran with the Knicks, the Hawks, and the Washington Bullets. Tom was an Olympian in 1972. Those of you remember the 72 games, and Tom will talk about that. The men's basketball, the incredible controversy at the end of that. The silver medal winning team, although they never picked up their silver medals, and he will discuss that. Very wise decision, I think. But represent our country so well at those Olympics in Munich. A 3-time All-American and 3-time academic All-American at the University of Maryland. And oh, just one last little thing, a Rhodes Scholar, Tom McMillen.
Thank you.
And my buddy and good friend, Jeremy Schaap. a fellow
This
journalist.
will be quicker.
Yeah, we've done nothing compared to these two. A reporter and host on ESPN, of course. Jeremy, you've won 6 National Sports Emmy Awards, and award-winning is just the beginning of describing his journalism, his ethics, what you see on air, the strength of the reporting, the quality. It's just terrific, and I'm proud to call you a friend. In addition to all that, best-selling author of Cinderella Man and Triumph, The Untold Story of Jesse Owens and Hitler's Olympics. And we met, I believe, was it the Lillehammer Games in '94?
It might have been Albertville, but
Okay.
at the very latest, it was Lillehammer.
And
yes.
I have to say that Jeremy's late father, Dick Schaap, who many of you probably remember, was a mentor and a real role model for me. And to be able to say that Jeremy Schaap is living up to his last name in every way is about the highest compliment I can give you. And I know there's someone up there who is very, very proud of your work. Jeremy Schaap, ladies and gentlemen. All right. So what we talked about earlier today was, since we have these 2 Olympians here, and it's not every day that we get a chance to talk about the Olympics and the experiences with 2 decorated Olympians, we thought we would first start with that. So Michelle, as I mentioned, the most dominant skater at the most turbulent time in the history of the sport, so decorated with all those awards and titles, an Olympic silver medal and an Olympic bronze medal, no Olympic gold medal, and yet you are so associated with the Olympic Games, so beloved in the Olympics, and I know how much you love the Olympics. Could you describe your journey in the Olympics and why you feel so great about the Games, even though you never won that elusive gold?
No, the Olympic gold, I still dream about it to this day. I've had an incredible skating career, you know, starting from '94, my first experience at the Olympics, where I was the alternate. And if you all remember the Nancy Kerrigan, Tanya Harding incident, I was second at the Nationals, and I was taken off the team, but still sent to Lillehammer, Norway, where I received a credential, and to me that was such a momentous kind of, I was like, I made it, wow, this is, and then actually having to wait 4 more years. My first Olympic experience, it was remarkable. I remember just how proud and honored I was to represent the United States and to dream of the moment since 7 years old watching Brian Boitano in the '88 Olympics. And my first practice in the arena, I remember skating over the Olympic rings, and I started to cry. And I caught myself, actually, I didn't catch myself, it was my coach, Frank Carroll, was like, step out of it! You've got a long 2 weeks before ahead of you. But it was just being there, you know, you dream of it since you're 7 years old. You eat, sleep, train, thinking of that moment of the Olympic Games. And unfortunately, I did not come home with the gold medal. Looking back, I'm like, I didn't really make mistakes. And that Olympics taught me so much. It taught me why I was in it. I was in skating because I loved it. When I was 17, it was a hard lesson to learn because before that, it was all the pursuit of winning the gold medal. Nothing else mattered. And it changed my perspective since then on, 17, 18 to my next Olympics in Salt Lake City in 2002. It was more like, enjoy the journey. And since 17 years old, it changed my perspective of the sport and realizing that it's not about winning and that you can train your hardest, you can try your best and have no regrets, but still not get what you want. And that's a hard lesson to learn in front of millions of people, but I take it with me everywhere I go to live every day with no regrets.
Well, and as someone who was covering those Nagano Games, you know, we've covered, you and I, have covered athletes 30-year-olds who play football, and we can see them, you know, cry and get angry and throw their helmet, and they get a chance to play the next week, and they couldn't handle a defeat, and they have 7 days to get to play again. This one, at 17, handled it so beautifully, and you had no guarantee that you were even going to have a chance 4 years later, but it would be 4 years later. It was a lesson, I think all of us reporters, I think your legacy marks time from how you handled that moment, and it was fantastic. Tom, you also had an interesting Olympic Games. I alluded to the controversy, and those of you who remember the 72 Munich Games, and of course, the ultimate tragedy of the 11 Israeli athletes and coaches who were killed on September 5th, 1972, when terrorists entered the village, changing things forever. I know you have a lot of thoughts, Tom, about that, and also, of course, about what happened to your basketball team.
Well, think back, it's hard to go back 40 years. It's hard to believe it was 40 years ago. My hair was dark. February of that year, Nixon went to China, a momentous occasion. Title IX passed around this time of the year. Watergate was broken into. And here we are, a young basketball team of 20-year-olds going over to Munich to play in games, the 72 Olympics, really the new Germany from the 1936 games you wrote about. And we, as a young basketball team, woke up on the morning of September 5th, realizing that the Olympic Village, a village built for sport, was being overtaken by terrorists, and that as that day wore on, those 8 terrorists ended up killing the 11 Israeli athletes. A sad day in history, really an event that Rudy Giuliani called the start of modern terrorism. 5 days later, on September 10th, this young team had to play the Soviet Union for the World Championship. The United States had never lost. We went into that game with great odds against us, but we came from behind. We ended up scoring 2 free throws, winning the game, we thought, and then the chaos ensued. The clock was turned back 3 separate times by the officials to keep replaying the last play over and over again so that the Soviet Union could win. On the 3rd time, the Soviet Union won. We as a team refused to accept the silver medal, and it went to arbitration the next day. Howard Cosell was the one that defended our case, and the vote was 3-2. The 3 nations were all East Bloc nations. The 2 nations were West Bloc nations. I told you the political part in the beginning because, quite frankly, Brezhnev and Nixon could have just arm wrestled that day. We didn't need to go on the basketball court. It was really a Cold War outcome. And it really shaped my view about the Olympics for years to come because it was such a momentous Olympics, which I think 2 legacies came out of that. One was security would never be the same. We spent $2 million in Munich. We'll spend $2 million in London on security. And the second thing is that was the beginning of the end of amateurism. After that, in subsequent years, you know, the dream team and the pros came in, and no longer would we send our college players to play against pros in the Olympics.
And well, there's so much more, of course, that comes from that with your personal history, which, of course, we're going to get into here in a few minutes. So, Jeremy, as a chronicler of all this, you, of course, know so well what Jesse Owens went through. You have really watched and studied the history of the Olympic movement. Your thoughts on the games themselves and what they mean?
Well, I think like Tom, I come to this with a fairly jaundiced perspective. You know, the Olympic Games, if you're going to go back to the beginning of the revival of the modern games in 1896, the brainchild of a French nobleman, Baron Pierre de Coubertin. And you know, the idea was to get French youth in good enough physical shape to be able to fight the Germans in a war that they expected would be coming one day or another. Of course, it came about 20 years later. They lost to the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War. And you know, the martial beginnings of the Olympics, I mean, are something that have been carried through despite some of the rhetoric for the course of the last 116 years. You know, one thing that's interesting from my perspective, having covered 7 games, is that in Tom's era, when he was competing, you know, it was at the height of the Cold War, and the games achieved this significance beyond sport. And this occurred, obviously, when the Soviets showed up for the first time in 1952 in Helsinki. And really, until 1988 in Seoul, which was just at the time that the Soviet Union was about to break up, the Olympics were about one thing: the United States versus the Soviet Union. And of course, that's exemplified in the 1972 basketball and the 1980 hockey game between the Soviets and the United States, the medal counts that were a feature of the coverage to such a large extent. And in the absence of this rivalry over the last 20 years, the Olympics have lost, I think, a lot of their significance. Before the Soviet Union entered in Helsinki in 1952, it was really kind of an overgrown track meet, as you know. Track and field was the centerpiece of the Summer Games. It was the focus of just about everybody's attention. There were occasionally big stories in the other sports, but it was really about this big track and field meet. And that changed when the Soviets showed up, and during the Cold War, of course, the athletes were used as proxies between the countries to prove who had a superior system. In the absence of that rivalry, I kind of struggle to figure out what the Olympics are really about. Maybe one day it'll be about a rivalry with the Chinese. There have been moments when the Chinese swimmers have suddenly gotten very good, and then the Chinese runners got very good, and then all of a sudden they started drug testing for different things, and they weren't very good anymore. But maybe it will become that one day. But I think in Lausanne, where the International Olympic Committee headquarters are situated, I think they're struggling to figure out where the Olympics go from here, other than just being an enterprise that lines the pockets of the people who are on the committee.
Right. And it's interesting, too, talking about the Soviet days, the East Germans as well. And Michelle, they even come up to your time in terms of knowing Katarina Witt so well. East Germany produces Katarina, the two-time Olympic gold medalist in figure skating. But you may remember the East Germans, of course, with the Soviets, there were a few Olympics when the East Germans won that medal count.
Yep.
Which I think we all agree up here, who really cares about the medal count, but we in the newspaper business and the TV business, we still churn it out, which I guess we're into accounting and into statistics. But talk about a meaningless statistic on so many levels. But the East Germans would throw so many athletes into swimming and track and field. Why? And wouldn't, for example, care about basketball. I don't even know if they had men's or women's basketball. At the end of the day, you have 12 athletes for a basketball team, and you play 2 weeks and you get 1 medal. But if you have
If you're
swimmers,
lucky.
yeah, right, exactly, 1, 2, or 3. But if you have swimmers or track and field, one athlete can win 5 or 6 or 7 medals. That's how the East Germans did it. They were so focused on that, to the point you made, Jeremy, about how it was their whole self-worth was, could they beat the U.S. and the Soviets in the Olympic medal count? And so,
I have a question.
yes.
When the media looks at competition, and I come from more of a pure kind of Olympics, and Pierre de Coubertin, when he thought of the Olympics, I don't think of war, and I don't think of preparation into war. I think of what he said about every individual has the possibility of using sports for self-improvement. That's kind of what I take from it. But yes, then again, you look at Yuna Kim versus a Korean skater versus Mao Sada, Japanese skater, and they have this rivalry from the tensions between the two countries. So then you have, when I was competing, it was Irina Slutskaya, an American skater. It was like always that Cold War kind of idea that maybe it was more, because athletes, I don't personally feel that it was like me against another country, even though you're representing a country. It's pure sport.
The world
It's pure
changed. I mean,
competition.
it probably felt different to Debbie Thomas when she was competing against Katarina Witt.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was
88.
yeah, 88 and 84, right? And both of them, that was the U.S. versus the German system, and the system that we assumed correctly was corrupt and doing all kinds of unspeakable things to its athletes.
Or is it too politicized, though? I mean,
Well,
it shouldn't be simple sports
yeah.
and friendly competition, or
Then why do they march in the opening ceremony under the banners of their nations? I mean, I see, they say this is about sports. It shouldn't be about politics, and we don't want to get involved, and we don't want to sanction this country for doing that or that country for doing that. But then, the teams the athletes are representing countries. They're not representing themselves as individuals.
Well, and Tom, if you think about this, we're kind of already getting into this micro, the individual athlete, and how, in this case, she looks at the competition versus the macro, which is, I think, obviously a big focus of this panel, and what these Olympics mean. I know you as an athlete were embroiled in it individually, but that bigger picture that I know is such a big part of your life.
And I think, looking back at that experience, it was a very, troubling moment in my life, and it took me years to step away from it to understand it, which it really, truly was, this nationalistic battle that was going on, and we were just pawns in that game. And that's been going on since time eternal in the Olympics. But The bigger question about the Olympics, I think, and I know they struggled with this in London, is are you really going to meet this objective of sports for all, creating opportunities for all your citizens? I mean, the United States of America is the only country in the world that does not have a sports for all national policy. And so London is struggling because they're saying, you know, we have goals. We want 1 million more citizens to exercise 3 times a week. And they have failed miserably. They'll admit it. Their sports minister, they'll say they are not doing a good job of, they wanted to leave this grassroots legacy, and they're not going to do it, even though they've spent $1.5 billion on this. But I really think truly, as we look ahead to the Olympics, we need to figure out how to create opportunities in sports for all citizens of the world. And that's got to be the Olympic challenge. And maybe London will fall short, but I give them great credit for at least taking this task on. And
Is Los Angeles the gold standard because of the, what, 250 million surplus that was then funneled into youth sport in LA?
well, it clearly was a wonderful example of what you could do. I mean, one of the problems that we talked about earlier is that, you know, we're building these facilities every 2 years around the world, enormously expensive. And maybe we should think about, you know, permanizing them for 50 years, put some in certain hemispheres and then let them play 50 years and go on. Because think about the amount of money that's going in for infrastructure and security, and that money could be used to build these grassroots programs. And so I think the Olympics are going to have to take a hard look at this, recycling these facilities around the world. It's an enormous task, and for London, the legacy of London is, yes, they'll have some facilities in London, but for most of the country, they don't really share in that.
Well, and as we know, you may remember the stories of Montreal, where I think they paid off the debt from the 1976 Summer Games last year.
I didn't know they got to
wasn't-
it yet. Yeah.
It was probably a few years ago, but you know, this was in fact, going to the '84 games, as you'll recall, only 2 cities bid for the Summer Olympics in '84: Los Angeles and Tehran. And if LA didn't take the games would have probably stopped. That's how bad it was. So the financial thing you're talking about was playing out back then. And I guess for Michelle, for you, legacy is so important in giving back, clearly, as it is for Tom, and what you love about the games. Could you talk a bit about that sense of legacy, either personally or what you have seen from your, I guess you've had 4 different visits to Olympics, 2 you didn't compete in, of course 2 you did.
Well, I travel as a member of the President's Council on Fitness, Sports, and Nutrition, and work closely with the First Lady's Let's Move initiative. And collaborating, you have these extraordinary Olympic athletes who are incredible role models to the youth all around the world. And in May, the USOC joined the Let's Move initiative, and the First Lady said, we need to get 1.7 million kids in Olympic-style activities. And I think that's what the legacy is all about, inspiring kids. I know that there was articles written about Michael Phelps throughout the 2-week span, but then realizing that after the closing ceremonies, the lasting impact is that young boys and girls ended up signing up at the YMCA or at their local facility to go swimming. So it is encouraging people to participate in sports, and hopefully after London Games, you'll have more swimmers, more divers, more runners, you have more people involved in sports. So I think that's the legacy, especially when there's an epidemic of 1.3 children that are obese in the United States. We need to change that. We need them to be inspired.
But are we throwing the person power as a country? I know we talked beforehand. We're talking about a couple staffers, right? Tom, you've talked about this. I know, Jeremy, you've written and talked about this too. Are we, okay, we're talking a good game here, and this is real. I mean, this comes from the heart, certainly from you two, and as journalists from both of us. But then what are we really doing? Are we doing it right? All of you?
I'll give one example. When I co-chaired the President's Council on Fitness and Sports under President Clinton, I went to Lillehammer on the official delegation with Mrs. Clinton. And so one of the things I was really marveled about the Norwegians was that they celebrated the award of their games by 1 million Norwegians go out and cross-country ski throughout their country. 2 years later, in '96, I went to Atlanta with the President Clinton on the delegation, and we celebrated our games by having 1 million people watch a torch runner run through our streets. Now, if that doesn't describe poignantly the difference between our countries, and that we we don't have that active participation. The First Lady's done, as you said, wonderful things in this, but it's unresourced. We really don't have the focus as a nation to make it happen. So.
Yeah, I think, you know, what Michelle and Tom are saying about the significance of getting people off their couches and competing is absolutely essential to what the Olympic movement is about. And I think, you know, the U.S. at this point is doing a relatively good job compared to some other countries in the world. We could do better, but what troubles me most is the lack of moral leadership from the International Olympic Committee, which sets policy and which sanctions all of the national Olympic committees. You know, for instance, right now, you know, there were a lot of reasons not to like Juan Antonio Samaranch, the longtime president of the International Olympic Committee, whose successor is now in power, Jacques Roga. But one thing he was committed to was increasing involvement by women. And so the number of women's sports went up exponentially in both the winter and the summer games. It was something that he seemed to truly care about. Yet here we are in 2012, and there are dozens of countries in good standing in the Olympic movement that do not adhere to the most basic principles of the Olympic Charter, which include allowing for all of your citizens, regardless of race, gender, religion, to compete for Olympic spots. There's a Saudi, I believe, on the executive committee. Saudi Arabia doesn't send women to the Olympics.
Although
They're going to have a token. They're going to have one, right?
Yeah.
An equestrian, I think.
Exactly, but that's after browbeating.
Exactly.
Yes.
Which proves nothing. You know, that they are that they're unwilling to change and they're resentful about being asked to change. And it's not just the Saudis. It's, you know, primarily Muslim and primarily Arab countries. But I don't understand the mixed messages, the mixed signals that are coming from Lausanne when they don't sanction countries that are members of the Olympic movement that blatantly violate their stated principles. The only, you know, they might privately say, we think it's better to work, you know, with them within the system than to make them, than to ostracize them, et cetera. But this has been going on for a long time, and there's been no significant movement. So for all of those, we're talking about tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of women out there who live in countries that don't think women should compete in sports, the Olympic Committee has been all but silent.
Well, Jeremy, when you were talking about the IOC and getting more women involved, I co-chaired the IOC conference in Los Angeles, women's conference, and Christine, I know you sat on a panel, and you were actually there when they were discussing cultural context, because when you're talking about gender and also culturally and religion, sports across is supposed to, it's not supposed to be biased. So in cultural context, sometimes women's apparel inhibit them from performing in sports. And during the conference, it was a learning experience for me, because here I am, you know, in a small, short Vera Wang costume, and not thinking that in terms of religion, and if I had worn something that could stop me from performing. So I think that's one of those things that we have to be conscious of, and I think the IOC is listening and trying to make it an opportunity for all women. Even across the board, yeah.
At these games in London, the percentages will be about 58% male, 42% female. They say they want to get to 50-50, but then, of course, they vote out softball back and continue to vote it out in a confusing thing. They thought they were voting out baseball. These IOC members really are a group of people, let me tell you. And, you know, it's not a good scene. And so you want to get to 50-50, but you get rid of a woman's sport. So, to your point, Jeremy and Michelle, I think it's people like,
I think
your generation, when you become, you know, our age, maybe, you know, let's hope that those
I'm not
changes.
competing anymore, so I can almost say something.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, you get in there and start taking care of it. But that gets to leadership. And I know that, you know, whether it's the NCAA, which is a Olympic feeder, believe it or not, our college system for a lot of our sports. If you watch these swimming trials that are going on that I was just covering in Omaha the last few days, you'll often see the swim cap will be of the college. a young man or woman is competing in. So that's huge. Obviously, the Amateur Sports Act, leadership across the board is part of the legacy. Is it not, Tom?
Well, it is, and you know, we're going to have a Sputnik moment in this country when we lose a whole bunch, when we don't win a whole bunch of medals in some Olympics, and it's going to happen, and there's a whole variety of reasons. You know, America has looked at its sports world in a very laissez-faire way. We're the only nation in the world that does not have a ministry of sport or a sub-ministry of sport of youth. And all the other nations of the world really focus on this. They put a lot of efforts into it. As I mentioned, the President's Council has $1.4 million budget. Let's Move doesn't even have a budget. I mean, it's impossible for us as a nation when we have a pyramid where all the money is going to the top, to elite sports. I mean, we've spent $20 billion on facility subsidies in the last 20 years in America. That's your taxpayer dollars. But when it comes down to programs at your schools and your communities, how about your universities? 200 programs have been cut from universities in the last 5 years. We are howling out our ability to develop young athletes in America, and this is going to become more pronounced by 2050 when America becomes a 54% minority nation. Those are the places we need to be investing in, you know, sports programs, in leagues and so forth, and we're not. And so that Sputnik moment's coming, and we as a nation need to rethink how we approach our national sports movement.
Tom, but as we talked about the games, you will tune in, I'm sure. You'll read USA Today. You'll check out ESPN, you know, and you'll do that for 2 weeks, and then it will end. And so I guess I'm wondering for the entire panel, yes, we care, right? But does it really change, and I'd love to hear from some of you on this too in a few minutes when we open it up for questions. Do you care if the Chinese beat the Americans? I mean, does it change your life if China wins the gold medal in gymnastics, even though we know they basically cheated and used underage gymnasts 4 years ago and got away with it, and these poor young kids that they abused, really. It's just, that's a terrible, I'm sure you remember from Beijing. But the IOC didn't want to have the Chinese lose face, so therefore they kept the gold medal. But they'll compete again in a few weeks. That's going to be a huge event, that U.S. China women's gymnastics kind of grudge match in the team competition. But do we really care? I mean, I know maybe back, I cared very much as a girl growing up watching that travesty of you guys not winning the gold in '72. But do we care? I mean, how much do we care? So Tom, the question then is, how much are we going to really have the energy to do the grassroots programs?
It's a fair question, but we should care because the emerging nations of the world, the nations of tomorrow, the growth nations of tomorrow are young. And young people are influenced by sports. And they're influenced by sports as a symbol of winning and having great athletes like Michelle. And so we should care. But it's not just about creating elite athletes, although I mean, we've done that fairly well. It's about creating the opportunities because there's so many other factors in here. There's obesity, there's all these other things that we ought to be weighing as a nation. Sports is a great opportunity. It's fun, people love to do it, they recreate, it has great dividends for your nation. We ought to be doing it for lots of reasons other than just winning gold medals.
Jeremy, what do you think?
I think the answer is we don't care as much as we used to. And there are a lot of reasons for that, some that I previously stated. You know, it's one of those paradoxes, I think. The amateur ideal that ruled at the Olympics for its first 8-9 decades, the modern games, was flawed and hypocritical. But at the same time, I think it did lend the game something that was about more than sports. And for every, you know, de facto professional who was playing on the Soviet hockey team or the Soviet basketball team, you know, there were legitimate amateurs out there. And there was a sense that, you know, this is an amazing fortnight because so much is at stake for these people. And if they don't get the chance now, who knows if they'll get it in 4 years or ever again. You know, now that we've got, you know, world championships in track and field, now that we've got world championships in swimming that are on national TV, and it's all been somewhat diminished. And so it's hard for me to feel compelled to watch the way I once did.
You know, Michelle, you, of course, did this for the love of the sport, starting out. There was no pot of gold. There was no guarantee. As I recall, your dad and your mom really sacrificed a lot for you and your sister to compete. Could you talk a little bit about that Olympic ideal? Because even though it's professional, it's still, there is that effort to throw yourself into a sport where there is no necessary guarantee. I know you weren't saying there was, but there still seems to be something that I see every now and then that seems better than your average professional athlete. Would you agree?
Well, I think a lot of young people watching the Olympics, they assume fame, glory, gold medal, you know, cereal boxes, but it doesn't work that way. I mean, my parents, I feel, when you talk about sacrifice, we're the ones sacrificing, because for me, it was choices. I decided not to go to the movies, hang out with friends late at night, sleepovers, because I knew that my dream, my goal was to make it to the Olympics and perform well. So I had to be, you know, at top of my game every day. So I think it was just the lessons learned in sports, things like hard work, teamwork. Although you see me out on the ice, you know, individual sport, I have a team of trainers, coaches. That's my team. And also when you think of like falling and getting back up and never giving up, those are valuable lessons that you learn in sport that you take on and are applicable to other areas in your life. So I think not necessarily going for the gold, what everybody kind of in society thinks, win or lose, and that's it. It's not clear like that. There's a gray area of learning and the journey and the way you kind of approach life is how I learned what I learned through sports. And I think essentially, yes, it was great to be on tour, Champions on Ice, to compete at the Olympics, to represent the country, but I think it's the journey and the lessons learned that my parents wanted me to experience.
I would echo that, because it's those intangibles as an athlete that you learn about playing on a team and learning to get along and failing and having to work through all that. And you know, I worry that we become a plutocracy sports nation where we are just following the money. And that generally means football, baseball, and basketball. And I think there's risk to that, because they're starting at 5 years old to naturally select kids and weed out everybody else. And kids drop out, and they go to their screen, they go to the computer, and they spend 6 hours a day. We ought to be focusing on getting kids involved in so many different sports, you know, softball and track and field and skating, all the things where we don't really support them. And I think that's a better vision for our nation than, you know, just relying on picking kids out at 6 years old to be the next Kevin Durant, which I think has problems for our nation, you know.
I don't want to come off as too negative about the Olympics and the Olympic movement, but one thing that I find disturbing is somebody who's been passionate about the Olympics my whole life and grew up, you know, in a household where the Olympics were important. I don't know how many books my father wrote about the Olympics and talked about it. One of my first memories of him going off to the Montreal games and bringing me back all these souvenirs. But I feel like, and the media is largely responsible for this, there was a time when the Olympics, as they were experienced by American audiences, really did kind of serve the whole notion of bringing the youth of the world together, and by extension, the peoples of the world together. And when you turned on ABC, which was really the home of the Olympics when the games grew into a phenomenon in this country, you know, Olga Korbut was as big a star as any American athlete. Nadia Comaneci was as big a star as any American athlete. You could go on and on. Bibi Bakila in 1960, Kip Keino, even before that, guys like Emil Zatopek and Vladimir Kutz, they were the stars, and they were treated as such by the American media. And I don't want to give you the wrong impression, because I've seen all these Olympics, you know, covering them in the countries, and countries do focus on their own athletes. When you're at the Winter Olympics in Norway, you know, you can't get away from Bjorn Daly and Vegard Ulvang. I mean, that's what they talk about, and Johan Olof Koss. But here, we had a more international approach, and I think that's gone now. I don't know how many people in this room can name a single foreign athlete. You know, everybody knows Michael Phelps, other than Usain Bolt, maybe. You know, Usain Bolt, people know, but you know, it used to be a litany. You know, the great gymnasts were known to even casual sports fans, the great figure skaters from other countries. And it's become strangely more parochial.
Right. Although I guess you could say that we could check with everybody, regroup here at the end of the games, and they'll probably have some names. I mean,
Yeah.
and we wouldn't have known who Olga Korbut or Nadia was until they burst onto the scene.
Right.
But absolutely, everything has become more jingoistic, I think.
I want to mention one thing, because you talked about the Amateur Sports Act in 1978. And a lot of people don't know what that act did, but what it did was it gave the United States Olympic Committee a monopoly. The AU, NCAA, they were all fighting, and so they, we were worried because we were starting to lose those Cold War medals, and so Congress and the government created the United States Olympic Committee. And they did some good things, like in '72, they passed the Title IX. But the Amateur Sports Act, there was one provision in it that said that the United States Olympic Committee was in charge of grassroots sports participation in America. Well, typical of Congress, we've really only had one oversight hearing in that whole legislation for all of these years. And the fact is that the United States Olympic Committee just can't do it. There's no money. It was sort of an unfunded mandate, as Tom Ferry says, where they were asked to do something and there was no money behind it. And so over the years, the United States Olympic Committee has to focus on winning medals, which you can't blame them. That's really what they're tasked to do. But the grassroots participation part is not done. And so sometimes I really think that we ought to go back and revisit how we fund that, how we finance that. And one of the areas that I think we ought to be looking at is, if we can spend $20 billion on your taxpayer dollars to build stadiums in this country, certainly we can come up with a couple $2 billion for our kids' sports programs. And so I think that is the missing link in the Amateur Sports Act. So
Before we go to questions, which we will in a moment or two, we talked earlier, 50 years from now, what does it look like? And just around the panel here, we're talking obviously 50 years from now in terms of Olympic sports. Do we have an Olympic Games? Are they just rotating between 3 or 4 cities just to keep costs down? Are the costs so astronomical that no one could bid and we don't have the Olympics? Or, God forbid, there's some kind of a war or what have you where that's the end of the Olympics, which certainly has looked like it's happening during our lifetime several times. Funding, money, how much we care about the games. Tom, why don't we start with you first?
I think 50 years it'll be 10 times bigger and it'll be much the same. I don't think the trend lines will change. Although they should, I don't think they will.
Michelle?
I agree. I don't think it will change at all.
Will it be more sports? Will it be more money? Will it be every network showing it? We'll be getting it in on our holograms and on our wallpaper and stuff like that?
Probably more holograms and
Yes and yes and yes.
yes, yeah.
What about you?
Hopefully more on the grassroots level.
I
too,
think like the other major sports events, nationally and globally, it'll just get bigger and bigger and bigger because it's really, sports is, my boss at ESPN, likes to say, my former boss said, the thing about sports, why, it's not going away and the ratings maintain themselves, you can't rent, tomorrow night's game. You can't, and the thrill of live sports is something that, we all experience and enjoy. And I agree, it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as the world gets smaller and smaller. I think we're going to, eventually it'll evolve to the point where, we see logos in the stadiums. That's been kind of the last, the last place they haven't gone. Pretty soon, the athletes are going to be wearing, uniforms that instead of saying the USA, it'll say Pepsi or something like that. But that's the trend everywhere.
What we see in soccer.
Yeah.
I will say only one thing could stop that, and I think it's the issue of nuclear proliferation and the risk of a mega terrorist event, which is not out of the realm in 50 years by any means. And so that's the legacy of Munich. The terrorism could create almost an impossibility to have such an event of that scale. It may have to disperse in the future. So that's something we can't predict.
And it's all of the foibles and the issues that we've discussed here. The reality is still, I believe Jim McKay used to say this, so I can hear it in his voice, or maybe your dad's voice, but that it is the largest regularly scheduled peacetime gathering of the world. And that's kind of a good thing. Anyway, questions. I know we saw a couple of, wow, my goodness, this is great. We have a microphone. Ma'am, I think, did you have your hand up a while ago? We'll start with you. Please wait for the mic.
Thank you. My name is Susie Ellis, and I'm from New York and have a company called Spa Finder Wellness. And I love the Olympics. I saw you, Michelle, when you were at Lake Arrowhead in California, and I'm certainly a fan. I wanted to just, and this is just as a, a viewer, when the when the gymnastic team from China won the award and cheated, it was so upsetting to me that that the media, the team, the coaches, there was this sort of acceptance or not talking about it. I don't know what the culture is, but I would say that that was something that maybe changed my experience of the Olympics being maybe entertainment, but not necessarily fair.
Well, NBC may have been doing that, and I don't mean to beat on NBC when they're not represented here, but what the heck? No, sorry.
Whatever.
Whatever. But certainly I wrote several columns, and many of us, my colleagues, at the time. Oh, in fact, it was being written about, well, I was saying it on, I worked with ABC News, and we were saying it all over ABC on Good Morning America. I was literally saying these things, they're cheating, this is wrong, they should give up the gold medal. I said all that. You didn't hear it on NBC. Probably I'll go into territory that is, is true, but if we don't talk about it, NBC's in business with the Olympics, with the International Olympic Committee. So ESPN will be covering the games. ABC News will be covering the games in terms of TV. Obviously, you can find all this online. I'm not telling you what to read or what to look at, but this will be my 15th Olympics, and I promise you, I write about this stuff and talk about this stuff all the time, as does Jeremy.
I mean, you're absolutely right. It was distressing, et cetera, but it's totally expected that something. I mean, look at Seoul in 1988 with Roy Jones. He was robbed of the gold medal. They gave him the best fighter of the games award, but he didn't win his gold medal match because two judges were on the take. This goes back forever. I mean, it is a problem, it's upsetting, but compared to the big picture, it's just insignificant to me. I mean, they gave the games to China, to an authoritarian regime that, tortures people because of their political beliefs and imprisons them. It does all these horrible things, and so, all right, they cheated and put a 13-year-old on the gymnastics team. I can't get that exercise.
Dissidents are still in jail today because they were put there for the Beijing Olympics, and the IOC has remained silent. Another absolutely reprehensible act by the IOC to give those games, as you said, to China, and to say they're going to change, and then to allow the awful repression of those who spoke out. Thankfully, London will have traffic, we'll have protests, and it will be wonderful because people will be able to speak their mind. Okay.
Can I add something?
Absolutely.
Well, in a sport like figure skating, where it's so subjective, and you have a panel of judges that you don't know whether they're judging your costumes or your hair or your fingernails, you have no idea. I remember having a conversation with somebody that was on that side, not a judge, but was hearing the conversation between the judges. And they said, well, your costume was so simple. It was just crushed velvet, blue, simple. I wanted something that, I look back in 20, 50 years, and I could show my grandma and grandkids and be like, oh, wow, what kind of outfit are you wearing? I went simple. And she told me, you didn't have enough makeup on. You didn't have, your costume compared to other skaters was simple and bland. And I was like, but weren't you judging, wasn't this like performance? So you have, things like what's fair, what's not fair. And from my personal experience, I'm like, how is that fair? How can I improve on that? That there was a critique that I couldn't do anything about. So when you're talking about fair play, it's not always fair across the board.
Thank you. Okay, where's the microphone? Why don't we go right here then, close to the microphone. We'll get to everyone. I do our best.
Hi, I'm Catherine Colwell. I'm from Dallas, Texas, and I'm a student athlete at Auburn University. I play volleyball. And I was really curious about the Saudi Arabian women. Can you guys expand on that? Because it's really interesting to me that only one woman got into it. How did she get in and no one else? Or what? Can you expand on that?
Well, I mean, Human Rights Watch issued a report a couple of weeks ago about women in sports in Saudi Arabia that they've been working on for, I think, at least a year. And it's very simple. Women in Saudi Arabia are not really allowed to compete in sports. If they find girls kicking around a soccer ball, they like send the police to break them up. And there's no system in place to get women to the Olympic Games. There's not even a system in place, at the much more fundamental levels. And it's a cultural, religious decision, that's been imposed by the regime there, and there's no bucking them. But as I said, the International Olympic Committee, which has a responsibility and has a platform to affect change, chooses not to, or chooses to do so only when so much pressure is exerted that it feels it has to.
The good news was that they did actually have to speak up at the conference that you were the co-chair of. We did ask Jacques Roga, why is there no woman from Saudi Arabia? And he did have to answer that we're working on it, and we hope there will be. So just by asking the question, he was forced to answer in a way he probably didn't want to. You asked about the specific athlete. She trains outside of the country and has done well enough that it makes sense that they would send her. It's a shame when you watch Saudi Arabia walk into the opening ceremonies, it's a shame that she won't be followed by 10 other women. Hopefully next time. Thank you for your question. All right, and let's see, the microphone is right there. Why don't we just work it over you, sir, right here? Thank you.
You talked about sort of the going away of the political overtones of the games. To me, I think there's a second question, which is sort of like, what's the effect of the X Games on the Olympic Games? We have the flying tomato now, but haven't other sports and the kind of excitement and innovation in sport that's going on made the Olympics look really rote and kind of stale by comparison?
Michelle, as someone from a sport that has been a traditional Olympic sport, and Tom too, what do you think of all of this stuff that's basically designed to get ratings and get younger people to watch the Olympics? What do you think?
I think the more sporting events, the better. You get it out there, but the Olympics will always stay the Olympics, in my personal view. Maybe because I'm biased in, competing in the Olympics, but flying tomato. But no, I don't think that at all takes away from the luster and the beauty of and the pureness of the Olympics. I don't see it.
Tom?
No, I would agree with that. I think that the traditional sports will continue to grow. China's building a million basketball courts, so they're going to have some good basketball players in the. But yet, new sports and new innovation, disruption is great. I think it makes the Olympics more exciting. So.
All right, let's move just right there. Yeah, we're going to get to. Oh, I see. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name's Rachel Mott. I'm one of the Bezos scholars, and what you were discussing about getting more young people involved really, to me, connects back to the idea we've been hearing a lot at this festival about storytelling. Because I know when I was 12, when Michelle was first competing in the Olympics, I was absolutely fascinated with you, but it was because of the story. And I teach middle school. I have 7th and 8th graders, and I find that they're the same way. So I guess my question is, how come more of the media doesn't focus around individual stories? Because I see them, they don't necessarily pick a US athlete. They pick someone from a sport that they're passionate about, whose story they've heard.
Well, I think if you're looking for them, you can find them. Certainly from now, over the course of the next several weeks, how many stories, can we do? You're going to hear about Missy Franklin nonstop. You're going to hear again about Michael Phelps nonstop, and Usain Bolt, and Ryan Lochte, and on and on and on. Those are individual stories. Are you talking about? I don't know. What you mean? Are you just talking about there should be more profiles?
Yeah, I guess that's the point. They've got all of these kids, and if you're really wanting to market to get more kids involved in sports, I guess how come the Olympics aren't marketed more towards a younger audience?
Well, I think they are to some degree, certainly having them in the summer. Kids can stay up later than the winter games, although I know a lot of kids stayed up late obviously you're one, to watch her. But I think that it will, I think to Jeremy's point, you're going to be inundated in a couple weeks here. And again, not to every newspaper already. If you went to any website And I can tell you at USA Today, they're doing 100 athletes in 100 days. So we're well into that. And you will get a 25-inch, so about a 1,000-word profile every single day at usatoday.com. Just click on Olympics. And they've been doing that and will continue till the games start. And they're terrific. So those things do exist. I think it's just, as Jeremy's point, just to actually look for them. And I understand if you want to come up afterwards, we can probably suggest a few other websites.
Now, my question, because we all had idols when we were kids, right? Who was your idol?
Brian Boitano. Christine knows Brian very well.
I was curious.
7 years old, just watching TV, and that was that moment that I said, "Oh, I want to compete at the Olympics," and that was it. That just.
And Tom, who was yours?
Well, Bill Bradley was 10 years older than I was, and he was the kind of player I wanted to emulate. So Bob Pettit, there's always I guess that's part of growing up is you always had your idol, which I agree with you totally. That's a very, very important part of the idolization for kids.
The gentleman in the white shirt, you've been waiting a long time, and we have another microphone coming to you. I didn't realize we had the two going, sorry.
Hi, my name's Greg Bangs, and I'm of the age where I watched that game. I was 17 years old. A comment I could have, I have a comment and then a question, because the question, I really want to come back to a little bit of a naive perspective on it. The kid in me wants to ask it. The comment is, Jeremy, to your point, where are we going with all this, the national aspect? I think we've evaded the obvious one here is, the real reason why it hasn't changed and where we're all going is the money. The technology and the money is just so inherent right now on all these lines that it's the gorilla that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and drives all this. And Tom, to that effect, in all areas, whether you see it in soccer, basketball, everything gets getting pushed down. They look for the money element, but you can still squeeze out those moments. And you can see it with kids, whether they're small in skating rinks or soccer fields or lacrosse fields, as you can see it. And that's going to lead to my question. At 17, even at those horrible Olympics, what happened, with the Israelis, there were some great moments, and there are some legacies I remember. 4 years earlier, Dick Fosbury changed high jumps by going over backwards. That's a legacy. He changed that sport right there. In a very small way, a great runner named Dick Waddle in 1972, every kid for the next 4 years in cross country wore a golf cap when he ran, along those lines, myself included. And so my question to you is, think about this. What is a legacy moment you guys take away from the Olympics that you remember? Something that still kind of makes you smile or you recognize every day?
That was a tough Olympics, to be honest with you. It was the camaraderie, representing your country. I guess the opening ceremony was the thing that I remember. So it was just so poignant to be there. But it was a pretty tumultuous Olympics, and I look back at it, and sometimes it just amazes me that all those things could happen in one Olympics. Just all the refereeing disputes, all the basketball. Of course, the Israeli incident was just tragic, and so I would say the opening ceremony was the thing that I remember the most.
It was Mark Spitz too, in his.
And of course, Mark Spitz. That was another.
Frank, right, and then the announcer. It's a fake Frank as the imposter comes on the track. It was the Haywire Olympics, certainly. Yes, Michelle, what's from one of your games?
I think the opening ceremonies in Salt Lake City, just walking behind the American flag and feeling so proud to represent the United States, and having a beret saying USA, and just thinking of my parents immigrating to the United States with the hope and the dream, and here I was just living the dream, and hanging out with the bobsledders instead of the figure skaters. I think of that, I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. I get to meet different people from different sports, and
I'll never forget wearing the Sears red, white, and blue outfits. Shows you about America was back then. But what were you in Sears outfits too?
Roots. No, Roots.
Yeah,
yes,
Roots.
And now it's Ralph Lauren.
Yeah. We probably have time for a couple more questions. Let's see, ma'am, right there. Yes, we'll get a microphone to you. 1 second. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mona Shipley, and I'm from India. I work for the British Council, and I have been working on a program called International Inspiration. It's supposed to be the London 2012 Education Legacy Program for London 2012. And the objective is to work in 20 countries and raise the profile of sport at the community, school, and at the elite level. And what we did in India was we worked with experts from the UK who came down to India, and we developed resources for school teachers where schools in India don't take sports very seriously, and that's why we don't get the medals. And at the end of the program, after 4 years, what happened, we have the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Sport take up the program, and they have put it in the national curriculum. And even though it will take time to roll out, but 2.8 million children are going to be affected by it by the end of maybe 2 or 3 years. And the whole objective of International Inspiration was to reach 20 countries, 12 million children. And India alone, we have reached 28 million children. So I think somewhere, even though I'm not part of the Olympics, I may not ever play, but a part of being an Olympic legacy, I think Olympics does have a very big role to play. And I'm like really very proud to be here and just to listen to all of your stories and say, Olympic, I think the trend does live on. It will always live on.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And do we have time for one more? Are we okay on time? One more question? And I'm sorry. So let's see here. You've had your hand up for quite a while, sir. Let's go here. And I'm sorry. Come on up. Oh, okay. Well, maybe we'll sneak in two then. My bad. I'm kidding.
My name is Robert Potter. I come from Dallas, Texas. And you touched a bit on the question I'm going to ask. If you look through the program of the Ideas Festival, the country whose name appears most is China. And I was going to ask you to comment on the Beijing Games, comment on the opening ceremony, and any other incidents besides the gymnastics, and was the Beijing Olympics a success from your perspective?
Well, as being there for a month, it was a success, but there's the world's biggest asterisk because of what they did to their people. And you remember how amazing the opening ceremonies, what, $150 million they spent on those? Immediately the London people were like, oh my gosh, we can't compete. And Sevco said, don't worry about it. We're going to do our own thing. And I hope London is just more simple and great, and they can still, spend money on their schools. Because in China, there was no arguing about whether you'd spend money on anything else. They decided that for them. And they threw all that money into that 3-hour show to glorify China. It was magnificent. It was overwhelming. But you may recall there was the lip-syncing issue where they just got rid of another girl and said, you're not pretty enough, and this one's going to lip-sing it, and the lip-syncing going on. Another young woman who was partially paralyzed. We didn't find that out. I blame NBC a little bit as well, not to just beat on them, but come on, are you journalists or are you part of the show? And frankly, my memories of China will always be mixed. An amazingly organized and beautifully run Olympic Games that will always be tainted by how they treated their people. One last little story. You know how in Sydney and Atlanta and Salt Lake City, every games we've been to, big TV screens, people gather in the town square. In China, they had the TV screen set up as the opening ceremonies were about to begin, 8:08 at 8 p.m. The police came along and unplugged the TV sets and sent everybody home because they were afraid of people gathering. That is the legacy of China's Olympics. One more quick question. Yes, sir. Right here. Our Olympian.
Yes.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy, for letting me ask a question.
Yes.
I was privileged to be in the Tokyo Games in '64, and I love the Olympics too, in spite of all of its warts, which you are describing together with the glory of it. When Michelle said it's about the journey, to me as an athlete, that's a really fundamental point, because learning that, an athlete learns to enjoy the journey and train, and then my attitude was I'd show up like everybody else and see who was going to win. And of course, to be competitive, you want to win. But Tom, if the games can spark much broader participation by kids, the question I have and the concern I have is that most kids don't learn that it's about the journey. Michelle learned that herself because of her own wisdom at age 17. Parents push kids, coaches push kids. It is about the money. And we raise a generation of kids who are focused on becoming an NBA star or an Olympic gold medalist and then making money. And so I think that that's a big piece that's missing in the puzzle of what we have to do with sports to achieve health and participation. So my question is, does that concern you? And if so, how can we address that piece of it?
Well, the University of Maryland, which we both know well, just cut 7 of 27 of its sports teams, sports that they've had for 20, 30, 50 years. Yeah, track and field and swimming and things like that. And, you know, not the kids that participate in those sports many times aren't doing it just for the pot of gold at the end. I mean, there's so many kids that play basketball because they want to be in the NBA, or football because they want to be in the NFL. But, you know, to that extent that we're not promoting those kinds of sports and diversity of opportunity, I think it's to our detriment as a nation, because it is the journey. And every kid can have a unique journey, whether they're going on to stardom in the Olympics or whether they're just going to be, you know, on the team in high school or on the team in their rec league. And I think that we can't ever forget that as a nation. I think that's the core of what the Olympics are about.
Michelle, do you want to have the last word?
Well, I pick up golf because I don't want to be in the Masters, but because I enjoy it. I go surf. I surf where I snowboard. That's because I love it, not because of, you know, the idea of winning medals in the X Games or anything. But I think what you're trying to do is just to inspire kids. And if you can, I think we've got a director of the sports ministry, but it's true. We need to focus on the grassroots level where you encourage kids, because, you know, the importance of physical education, because of budget cuts and because of funding or what have you, kids aren't learning the importance of exercising and playing in sports and eating well. So I think that's why I like being on the President's Council, and I have a sense of responsibility being an athlete and sharing that sort of message.
Well, Michelle, thank you. Tom, thank you. Jeremy, thanks, and thanks to all of you. Really appreciate it.